Welcome. This lecture is the 7th lecture in the series on H.P. Blavatsky's role in transforming the world mentality. The theme of today is from consciousness as the cause of the phenomenal world to a new foundation for science. When you open the Secret Doctrine, you see on the title page that Theosophy is the synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion. What does that mean? It means that when you investigate truth, according to a theosophical approach, you use science, philosophy, and religion in conjunction as three inner instruments to find the truth. The most important starting point of Theosophy is the first proposition of the boundless life principle that is the deepest essence and source of every living being. And if you think deeply about this starting point, you can come to the conclusion that the following consequences follow from it. Everything in the cosmos is alive. All life is in its deepest essence one, is a unity, and in that unity all beings, whether it is an atom, a human being, or a sun, are equal. All beings are connected to each other, interact, influence each other, learn from each other, and grow as a result. How does this premise work in searching for truth? First, religion. The idea that everything is alive, part of the unity of life, and that there is an essential equivalence of all beings, immediately indicates that ethical issues can and will soon arise. To what extent is the development of one being at the expense of the development of another being, or is it actually a stimulus for it? In other words, is it consistent with what you know internally, what is right, in a given situation, with your conscience, and with your intuition and inspiration, with the highest within yourself? All this appeals to our religious sense and helps us answer the question of the what for, of the purpose of life. Then philosophy. The awareness of the interconnectedness and coherence of all beings, as we can recognize in ecosystems, for example, is based on the insight and understanding we have built up. And if you truly see through the core or essence of such coherence, then you are able also, through your insight and understanding, to recognize that essence, as it were, always and everywhere. The key question here is our insight universal? This corresponds to the philosophical awareness in us and helps us answer the question of the why of things, understanding the causes behind them. Then science. Finally, it is also important to know what exactly the facts are when we are investigating the truth. In doing so, the use of our intellect and logic is of great importance. Science can therefore be defined as logically ordered and classified knowledge based on research and experiments. And then the categorized facts are linked to explanatory theories, because, very important, the same facts can sometimes be logically explained in a different way. This instrument corresponds with the scientific sense in us and helps us find answers to the question of the how of everything. What is the relationship between science, philosophy, and religion? They are three aspects of truth. They belong together and support each other. Religion ensures that science and philosophy are based on the unity idea and focus primarily on ethically correct issues, which support the development of all living beings. Philosophy can fulfill a bridging function by emphasizing the universality in everything and the causes of everything. As a result, religious and scientific insights can be made increasingly universal and causal and do not degenerate into dogma. Science prevents religion from degenerating into superstition and prevents speculation in philosophy, which causes it to degenerate into an empty word game. In summary, we could say that the difference between religion, philosophy, and science is only a difference in the method of reaching the truth, because the goal of all three is identical: finding the truth. Therefore, real science should be just as religious and philosophical, and real philosophy should be just as religious and scientific, and real religion should be just as scientific and philosophical. The synthesis approach is not new and can also be found, for instance, in the history of Indian philosophy with the so-called Sat-darshanas, the six schools with a different emphasis in the realization of the higher self, two with an emphasis on science, two with an emphasis on philosophy, and two with an emphasis on religion. In this lecture, the emphasis will be on science as an integral part of the three perspectives of science, philosophy, and religion. This means that the task of science is explicitly considered in terms of its potential to contribute to the evolutionary development of all living beings and to the ethical moral development, the elevation of humanity in particular. It is good to realize that the teachings of Theosophy have been checked by the great sages according to the highest scientific requirements at all planes of existence. And to the extent that we are currently able to do so, these can also be checked by ourselves at our own plane of existence. When Madame Blavatsky introduced Theosophy in the 19th century as the synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion, she did so, as already mentioned, on the basis of the idea that everything in the cosmos is alive, and there is therefore no such thing as lifeless or dead matter. After all what we have said, we will once again look at the concept of science, as that concept has been regarded over the centuries from the ancient wisdom or theosophy. The science that was part of theosophy has often been referred to in other words such as spiritual or esoteric science, occult science, or occultism, as science in general was referred to in the Middle Ages. And to find that a little more precisely, spiritual, esoteric, or occult science, or occultism, is the science and the study of the things which are invisible, secret, sacred, the study of the inner structure, operations, powers, and so-called laws of the universe. It is therefore the science of causal things, and therefore of things that are in most cases invisible to us. Theosophy as it is now brought out, is the theoretical presentation of occult science. And because man is an inseparable part of the universe, the hidden forces, energies, and workings of the inner and invisible man naturally also form a part of the study of the true spiritual or occult scientist. This idea can be found in many cultures, such as, for example, with the ancient Greeks, where above the Temple of Delphi was written, "Man, know thyself." After this introduction, we will now look at the situation of science at the end of the 19th century. Science at the end of the 19th century, but in fact even today, had and has no conclusive answer to questions such as how the cosmos came into being, how life and how consciousness came into being. What was the state of science at the end of the 19th century? Science was based for 100% on a materialistic view, that is, substance or matter as a starting point, and there was a great rigidity in thinking. The physicists felt that they had fulfilled their task. A leading scientist of the time said in a speech in 1893 that all the great discoveries in physics had already been made. The physics of the future, he argued, would have little more to do than repeat the experiments of the past in order to determine here and there a constant in a formula more accurately. The mood was such that the chairman of the physics department at Harvard University discouraged students from taking the course because few important issues remained unsolved. In 1877, Madame Blavatsky published the book Isis Unveiled, in which she illustrated in various ways how little materialistic science explains about the origin of the cosmos and of man. Subsequently, in 1888, the Secret Doctrine was published, in which the central premise is that life or consciousness is the cause of the phenomenal world. You yourself can also think very well about and investigate the correctness of this premise. Certainly, if you start from the universal definition of a living being as given by Plato, namely the ability of self-motion. That means being able to act, being able to move by oneself, and being able to react on the actions of other beings. And in particular, this premise of consciousness would form the new foundation for science. In the Secret Doctrine, a fascinating prediction is made about the impending changes in science, and I quote, "The exact extent, depth, breadth, and length of the mysteries of nature are to be found only in Eastern esoteric sciences. So vast and so profound are these that hardly a very few of the highest initiates, those whose very existence is known but to a small number of adepts, are capable of assimilating the knowledge. Yet it is all there, and one by one, facts and processes in nature's workshops are permitted to find their way into the exact sciences, while mysterious help is given to rare individuals in unraveling its arcana. It is at the close of great cycles, in connection with racial development, that such events generally take place. We are at the very close of the cycle of 5,000 years of the present Aryan Kali Yuga, and between this time, 1888, and 1897, there will be a large rent made in the veil of nature, and materialistic science will receive a death blow." Unquote. And that prediction, and a number of other predictions in the Secret Doctrine, did indeed come true. And they can be divided in two groups. The discoveries that related to the predicted rent in science in the period 1888 till 1897, we will discuss these first, and the discoveries foreseen in the Secret Doctrine that were to take place in the course of the 20th century. In physics, up until 1888, the concept of the atom was already known, but atoms were considered to be small, hard balls that are indivisible, and it was assumed that atoms of a certain element are all identical to each other. But then new facts were discovered. In 1895, Röntgen discovered the so-called Röntgen radiation. He had discovered mysterious radiation that passed through some opaque objects as easily as sunlight through a glass window. There was nothing in 19th century physics that could explain this phenomena. On this basis, Röntgen was awarded the first Nobel Prize for Physics in 1901. The next major discovery in the field of atomic physics was made in 1896 by Becquerel, and that was the discovery of the radioactivity of certain substances. This was a real revolution in thinking, because it was assumed that every type of atom was unchangeable forever. But now it turned out that some of these atoms, such as uranium, are unstable and radiate energy and transform themselves into other atoms. Together with Marie and Pierre Curie, who soon discovered other radioactive elements such as thorium, radium, and polonium, he received the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1903. Then, in 1897, the electron was discovered by J.J. Thomson. This discovery was preceded in particular by the research of Sir William Crookes, who had been working on radiant matter in vacuum tubes. The radiation that he had observed in those tubes appeared 20 years later to be explained as a stream of electrons. In the Secret Doctrine, it was already predicted that Crookes' discovery of radiant matter would have a further elucidation on the true source of light and would overthrow all earlier speculations. Later it would become clear that there would be an enormous acceleration in science through the use of electronic instruments. By the end of the 19th century, it was clear that a major revolution had taken place in the field of physics. The discoveries mentioned before convinced scientists that their task had only just begun. The time had come to gain more insight into the secrets of the atom. At the beginning of the 20th century, two more discoveries further undermined the foundations of materialistic science. In 1900, Max Planck laid the foundation for quantum physics by observing that matter emits and absorbs radiation in packets of energy called quanta instead of in continuous streams. He thereby demonstrated that light has the character of both a wave and a particle. In 1905, Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, which, among other things, made clear what the relationship is between mass and energy, namely, energy is mass times the speed of light squared. More about this in a moment. In the 20th century, a number of discoveries took place in physics that were already anticipated in the Secret Doctrine, and we will give 3 examples. 1. Atoms are infinitely divisible. Until the electron was discovered in 1897, the scientific view of atoms was that they were very small, hard spheres that were indivisible. This is what was said about atoms in the Secret Doctrine, and I quote, "The atom is elastic, ergo the atom is divisible and must consist of particles or subatoms, and it is on the doctrine of the elusive nature of matter and the infinite divisibility of the atom that the whole science of occultism is built." Unquote. And indeed, time has shown that other particles were discovered again and again after the electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks, and yet other subatomic particles. The second example. Atoms are constantly in motion. Scientists at the end of the 19th century believed not only that atoms were indivisible, but also that they were motionless in apparently immobile masses except in the gaseous or liquid state. In the Secret Doctrine we can find, and I quote, "Occultism says that in all cases where matter appears inert, that is, not reacting, it is the most active. A wooden or a stone block is motionless and impenetrable to all intents and purposes. Nevertheless, and de facto, its particles are in ceaseless eternal vibrations, which is so rapid that to the physical eye the body seems absolutely devoid of motion." Unquote. The third example. Matter and energy are related. We already discussed this in the theory of relativity developed by Einstein, which shows the relationship between mass and energy. To put this in a general way, matter is densified or crystallized energy or force, and energy or force is matter in motion. In the Secret Doctrine, we find a quote relevant in this respect, which concerns the concept of the monad, introduced by the philosopher Leibniz. The monad is an eternal and indivisible center of consciousness. The quote reads as follows: "The monads of Leibniz may from one point of view be called force, from another matter. To occult science, force and matter are only two sides of the same substance." Unquote. In short, this idea was very clearly expressed in the Secret Doctrine. Einstein is known to have, according to his niece, always a Secret Doctrine on his desk in which he made many notes. In addition to physics, now also an example from the field of biology, and more specifically, the genetic code. In 1953, the genetic code of DNA was deciphered by James Watson and Francis Crick as a solution to important mysteries in cell biology. But nowadays, biologists are aware of several remaining questions in this. For example, the source from which the genetic code originates is still unclear. In the Secret Doctrine, we find the following clue. The whole issue of the quarrel between the profane and the esoteric sciences depends upon the belief in and demonstration of the existence of an astral body within the physical, the former independent of the latter." Unquote. Thus, the DNA in fact reflects in the physical world the characteristics of the astral body. One of the evidences that can be cited for the existence of the astral body as a model body for the physical body is the well-known phenomenon of phantom pains in cases of amputations of an arm or a leg. So much for an example from biology. And there is more to tell about the Secret Doctrine as a source of scientific inspiration in the 20th century. What were Madame Blavatsky's own expectations regarding changes in science? Madame Blavatsky believed that scientists in general would ignore her writings for years to come. She said, "They will be driven out of their position, not by spiritual, theosophical, or any other physical or even mental phenomena, but simply by the enormous gaps and chasms that open daily and will still be opening before them as one discovery follows the other, until they are finally knocked off their feet by the ninth wave of simple common sense." Furthermore, she wrote, "For in the 20th century of our era, scholars will begin to recognize that the Secret Doctrine has neither been invented nor exaggerated, but, on the contrary, simply outlined, and finally that its teachings antedate the Vedas." And she said also, "It is only in the 20th century that portions, if not the whole, of the present work will be vindicated." Unquote. It is interesting to consider some facts about how the Secret Doctrine had aroused the interest of some of the world's leading scientists, such as Albert Einstein. As I mentioned, Einstein's cousin explained that he always had a copy of the Secret Doctrine on his desk. How did that happen? Nobel Prize-winning physicist Robert Millikan was working at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, when he helped Einstein come to the United States in the 1930s when he wanted to flee from Europe. Millikan was very interested in the Secret Doctrine. When he was at Caltech, there was such a demand at the library to borrow the only copy that you had to put your name on the waiting list. It is likely that Millikan was one of the people who aroused Einstein's interest in the Secret Doctrine. Another candidate was Gustav Strömberg, an astrophysicist at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Los Angeles. Strömberg and Einstein worked together there and became friends. Strömberg occasionally visited the Theosophical Society at Point Loma and also gave a lecture there. When he published a book with the telling title "The Soul of the Universe," Einstein's recommendation was on the cover. During this period, Boris Dezirkov, the compiler of H.P. Blavatsky collected writings, also visited the Mount Wilson Observatory several times. He noticed that all the scientists were interested in Theosophy, especially Dr. Hubble, who would later become famous for the theory of the expanding universe. So you see that the metaphysics, the spiritual or occult science from the Secret Doctrine, gradually began to penetrate the world of leading scientists. From 1911 onwards, a number of these scientists began to meet regularly on the global level, including during the so-called Solvay conferences, which dealt with the most important issues in the field of physics and chemistry. This photo shows the participants of the 5th Solvay conference in 1927 in Brussels, chaired by Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, with the theme Electrons and Photons. The photo is also called the most intelligent photo ever because of the 29 participants, of which 17 would one day win the Nobel Prize. It is not surprising that the current publishers of the Secret Doctrine report that book orders still come regularly from professors at universities and colleges. It is also known that there are study clubs at renowned universities such as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in the US, where students and teachers meet to study the Secret Doctrine. It was also the case that there were prominent scientists who had come to the conclusion that life or consciousness must play a fundamental role somewhere in nature. In the 1980s, philosopher Ken Wilber investigated the ideas of prominent physicists and metaphysics and mysticism. He examined the writings of Einstein, Planck, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Jeans and Eddington, among others, and concluded that they all expressed a deep conviction that physics and mysticism were somehow twin brothers. Each of these remarkable people came to a mystical or transcendental worldview which sees the world as a spiritual, life-based phenomena rather than a material phenomenon. An example of a very clear idea regarding the living cosmos is the following quote from Einstein. "It is enough for me to contemplate the mystery of conscious life, which continues through all eternity, to reflect on the beautiful structure of the universe, which we can dimly perceive, and to try humbly to comprehend even an infinitesimal part of the intelligence which manifests itself in nature." Unquote. What about these ideas among 21st century scientists? There is currently a small but growing group of scientists who are investigating the idea that consciousness is the basis of nature. Some assume cosmic consciousness as the basis, as the source of all beings. These pioneers try to find alternatives to the assumptions behind materialistic scientific theories, and they often borrow their ideas from the great thinkers of the past, such as Pythagoras and Gautama the Buddha. An example is the scientist Itai Shani. According to him, individual beings emerge from an omnipresent field of consciousness like vortices emerge in an ocean. Other scientists are Bernardo Kastrup and Andrew Lorach and Bruce Bream. The pioneering work of these promising scientists can certainly have a major impact on the future of science. For more information, we would like to refer to an article in our magazine Lucifer the Lightbringer in 2022 about recent research into consciousness as a foundation, and also to the lecture series held in 2023 on spiritual science, the new scientific mentality. Before we sketch a more extensive picture of spiritual or occult science, we will first give a brief, somewhat black and white comparison between modern materialistic science and spiritual science to clearly show the difference. First, modern science. In many areas of modern science, there is a clear separation between the material world and the world of life or consciousness. For example, it is usually assumed that consciousness results from developments in matter, and material atoms, for example, are considered lifeless. The emphasis in scientific evidence is on objectivity, keeping distance from the subject of study. Man and cosmos have, as it were, no deeper relationship with each other, just as a fish would have nothing to do with the sea from which it comes. The explanations for phenomena are sought almost exclusively in the material world. The development of knowledge is mainly inductive, bottom-up, from the details to more universal visions. Then, spiritual or occult science. In spiritual or occult science, consciousness and matter are considered relative to each other, and in fact form one big whole. And man is considered an integral part of the cosmos. Self-motion is used as a characteristic of all living beings, namely being able to act, being able to move on its own, and being able to react on the actions of other beings. And that applies to everything that exists in the cosmos. The position of the spiritual scientist in his research is that he concentrates on and identifies himself with his subject of study. We could therefore call this a subjective starting point. The consideration of the spiritual scientist is that he can only take note of other worlds to the extent that he can identify himself with those worlds in a supra-personal way from his conceptual way of thinking. After all, man comes from the cosmos and must therefore also have the essences of it within him. An example: think of a detective film. Who did it and why? The detective is successful if he puts himself completely in the shoes of the case he's working on and can get an idea of the motives of those involved. Explanations for phenomena are always sought, assuming that everything in the cosmos is alive or driven by consciousness. In spiritual science, the unity of all life is always assumed. Knowledge is built up from universal, that is, always and everywhere valid, principles. From there, facts are thought that confirm and substantiate those principles. In short, the focus is on the deductive method, from general principles to specific facts, top down, and subsequently, based on fact, check the principles inductively bottom up. This is the method that Plato taught. An example: the second proposition of Theosophy presents the idea of cyclic motion applied to man This is expressed in the cycle of reincarnation. We will now attempt to build a concise picture of which thoughts are fundamental to spiritual or occult science, starting from the teachings of Theosophy. We will do this in the following steps. The cosmos, considered as a hierarchy of life, the dynamics in the cosmos, considered as interactions between higher and lower developed beings, and the place of man in it, while considering the potentials of the human consciousness. We start with the cosmos, considered as a hierarchy of life. As mentioned earlier, Theosophy assumes a boundless life principle. All manifested life flows from it periodically and returns to it periodically. There is also one law, as we can see in the process of emanation, in which a higher developed being, as a source being, emanates a sphere, a source field, from itself, in which lower developed beings can manifest and further develop themselves. These lower developed beings are then also source beings for even lower developed beings, etc. It's a great universal process of interconnectedness and cooperation. In this way, an entire hierarchy of living beings emerges, referred to in Greek philosophy as the great fullness or pleroma. In addition, the planetary being of the Earth has its existence within the sphere of the solar system. Man has its existence within the sphere of the Earth, and the cell beings of our body have their existence within the sphere of our human consciousness. We can therefore speak of spheres within spheres and life within life. At every level in the hierarchy, there is cyclic cooperation between higher and lower developed beings. Thus, according to Theosophy, the planet Earth does not exist on just one, but on 7 cosmic planes. In this, the lower planes emanate from the higher planes in stages. Each plane is therefore a causal plane for a plane below it. From the third formless plane or world from above, indicated by names such as ether, akasha, or cosmic waters, depending on the tradition, the lower 4 planes or worlds of manifested forms emanate. These worlds are often indicated by the names of the cosmic elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Each of these worlds also has 7 sub-worlds. Not only cosmic beings like the Earth, but all beings have a composite nature on 7 levels. Also man, as can be shown as follows. The upper 3 principles together form the higher self or the individuality, the imperishable part of man. The lower 4 principles form the lower self or the personality, the perishable part of man. Man can be seen as a microcosm in the macrocosm. If we relate the 7 worlds of the planet with the 7 principles of man, then Theosophy teaches that man goes through his total evolutionary development on the lower 4 of the 7 worlds of planet Earth. We will not go into the details of this now and refer you to other lectures and literature. How should we understand the laws of nature in all this? Laws of nature, as we know them, are the habitual patterns of cosmic beings, such as the solar being and the planetary being of the Earth. These habitual patterns are expressed by means of the characteristic vital, so-called phoetic forces that emanate from these cosmic beings, such as different types of electromagnetism. In other words, the cosmic beings determine the characteristics of the forces of the atmosphere that they radiate. This characteristic is universal and continuous, and we therefore experience it as laws of nature that we see operating around us. For example, think of the so-called solar wind, which causes effects on Earth such as the northern light. These vital forces are bipolar and result in attraction and repulsion of beings within the sphere. As for force or energy, Theosophy and modern science have, at first sight, the same image. Force and matter are one. Force is matter in motion, matter is crystallized force. However, there is an essential difference. According to modern materialistic science, force and matter are inanimate. In addition, the convertibility of forces is assumed. For example, that an electrical force is converted into a mechanical force. From Theosophy, both force and matter are a manifestation of life or consciousness. In addition, it is not assumed that one force is converted into the other force, but that one force activates the other force. Consider the example of two string instruments, a violin and a cello. If you play a certain note on one instrument, it will resonate on the other instrument at a different octave as a result of a similarity in characteristics. How exactly does the interaction between beings of different levels in the cosmos take place? Every being has its existence in the sphere of influence of a higher being. For example, man lives within the sphere of the planetary being of the Earth. Each being in turn radiates a characteristic sphere. For example, every person radiates a characteristic psychomagnetic sphere that reacts to the field of a higher consciousness, such as that of the Earth. This is the counterforce or reaction force. Through the interaction between the field force of the higher being and the counterforce of the lower being, a balance is always established on the basis of attraction and repulsion. Without going into mathematical details, this can be seen, for example, in Newton's formula for gravity, which describes the attraction between two masses, and Coulomb's formula, which describes the attraction between two electrical charges. Both formulas have the same structure and consist essentially of the same components. From a theosophical perspective, these formulas can also provide insight into attraction and repulsion on the mental and spiritual plane in addition to the physical plane. Now, some examples of interaction between higher and lower beings. An example of a special reaction force of creatures in the gravitational field of the Earth is that of whales. They can instinctively influence the interaction with the gravitational field when diving and ascending at an accelerated speeds in deep water, in addition to hydrostatic and hydrodynamic effects. However, this has not been sufficiently scientifically investigated yet. The next example. In nature, we see so-called group spawning behavior in various coral organisms. The season of the year certainly plays a role in this, but the position of the moon also plays an important role. We have now discussed examples of the interaction of humans and animals with the sphere of influence of the Earth and the moon. Analogously, there are lower beings within the material and non-material sphere of influence of man, who react in their own way to that human sphere of influence. First, a material example. Physicists have known for some time that a light quantum, a photon, behaves either as a particle or as a wave, and which behavior the physicist measures depends on the chosen measuring method, that is, on the type of sphere of influence that he creates for the photon. From the perspective of Theosophy, a photon is also a being with free will, however limited it may be. The reaction of a photon will therefore always be unique in the chosen sphere of influence of the experimental setup based on its free will. With that idea in mind, the following fact is perhaps less surprising, that the physicist has already established that it is not possible to determine the position and the speed of a photon at the same time. In physics, this is called the uncertainty principle, and that has everything to do with the fact that the photon is a living being with a free will. Then, a non-material example. There are known examples of the obvious reaction of crystal-forming substances to non-material influences. For example, water and the formation of ice crystals, and the influence that human thought, such as loving or angry thoughts, can have on them. See, for instance, the famous experiments of the Japanese investigator Masaru Emoto. This type of research has been successfully repeated by several other researchers. And who doesn't know the example of someone with green fingers, whose house plants thrive? Now, what are the potentials of the human consciousness, for example, in scientific research? The average modern scientist is predominantly or exclusively focused on the material realm. Some scientists are focused on research out of scientific curiosity. Others are focused on profitable application out of desire. The question here is how the material and desire-oriented thought patterns can ultimately be broken through. The spiritual or occult scientist will have developed or will be developing other thought patterns. Firstly, by assuming the correct ethical moral objectives that enhance the evolutionary development of all beings. And secondly, by assuming the existence of non-material worlds and spheres in the living cosmos and in man, as just outlined. And the more man is able to develop the higher principles in himself, such as in addition to logical intellectual thinking, also insightful, intuitive thinking, with associated high ideals and even inspiration, the more he will be able to penetrate deeper into the real causes behind the world of phenomena in our material world. I have just shown you that there are other more causal worlds above or within the material world. Therefore, you will find in all the historical expressions of occult science the advice that man should primarily study and control himself, in order then to be able to penetrate to these other, more causal worlds by identifying himself with them. And remember again what was written above the Temple of Delphi: man, know thyself. The ancients held that any idea will manifest itself externally if one's attention and will is deeply concentrated on it. The spiritual scientists make use of imagination, mind, and willpower. What do these mean? Imagination should not be confused with fantasy, which has no relation with reality. Madame Blavatsky describes it as follows. Imagination is one of the plastic powers of the higher soul and is the memory of the preceding incarnations which, however disfigured by the lower manas, yet rests always on the ground of truth. Unquote. Imagination is therefore a creative faculty which, used in combination with the will, not only evokes creative forces, but also their results. G. de Perucker explains that imagination is identical with intuition, the true image-forming faculty in man, the direct seeing of truth. In the highest form by inspiration of the inner God, but also by the memory, the reminiscence of the higher soul from previous incarnations. The abstract image or concept evoked in the imagination will have to be further elaborated and concretized with the mind by keeping the attention and the will concentrated on it, in order then to be able to realize this image in the concrete physical world. These successive process phases correspond on the basis of the principle as above, so below, with the four lowest cosmic worlds of the sevenfold structure of the planet, as just shown, that go from the abstract archetypical model to the concrete realization in the material form. See the example in the table, how the abstract concept of movement through the air goes through the following process phases. Intellectually devising a force that counterbalances gravity, devising a suitable form for this, and ultimately the concrete realization of an aircraft. The next question is, what is the characteristic of the energy or force used by man? According to materialistic science, the energy or force used by man can be seen separately from the influence of the coloring by the person who exerts a certain force. So one looks only at the physical plane and leaves out of consideration the mental and spiritual plane. However, there is sometimes an awareness of ethical issues surrounding certain applications, such as nuclear energy. What we also see is that there is an increasing awareness in science that the researcher always has an influence on what he observes. And that can be explained well from the perspective of spiritual science. I just gave examples of that. According to spiritual science, forces or energies are emanations of beings, of which the material component seems to be equal mathematically, according to modern science, but in terms of the mental component, the influence, as a result of their difference in characteristics and intentions, differs greatly and is therefore unequal. Take the following example. Someone gives a gift. The intention with which this happens determines what really happens here, and is usually also felt by the recipient, and also determines the karmic result. From the perspective of the unity of all life, the question is, how much does a certain action, such as a certain scientific research, contribute to the possible evolutionary development of all beings and to cosmic harmony? In previous lectures, it has already been explained that Universal Brotherhood is a fact in the cosmos and compassion is the keynote of nature. In the first letter to the Englishman Hume, Master Kutumi gives the following interesting example. Person 1 uses a certain amount of brute energy, as he calls it, to pave a path through a forest. Person 2, an experimental scientist, uses arithmetically an equal amount of energy to set a pendulum into motion for his research into it. The master judges that due to a difference in characteristics and intention, there is nevertheless a difference in quality of the energy used by person 1 and person 2. He says, the idea I wish to convey is that the result of the highest intellection in the scientifically occupied brain is the evolution of a sublimated form of spiritual energy, which in the cosmic action is productive of illimitable results, while the automatically acting brain holds or stirs up in itself only a certain quantum of brute force that is unfruitful of benefit for the individual or humanity. Unquote. The difference in quality of energy used by person 1 and 2 can be described as a difference in mental influence due to the difference in characteristic and intention, and the development of a higher form of energy in the case of person 2, which is fruitful for the individual or for humanity. And as to the unlimited results of which the Master speaks, we find in the Secret Doctrine the following further explanation, and I quote, "It is a law of occult dynamics that a given amount of energy expended on the spiritual astral plane is productive of far greater results than the same amount expended on the physical objective plane of existence, and the suppression of one single bad cause will suppress not one, but a variety of bad effects." Unquote. In other words, it is about directing our energy as much as possible to the deepest causes of a particular phenomena or issue, and therefore contributing to the initiation of a series of consequences that help to promote harmony in the world. At the beginning of this lecture, we already explained that science, spiritual science to be precise, should not only be focused on logic, but also on universality and ethics. The spiritual scientist will thus strive for a universal insight into truth, and the result, in the example of the pendulum, goes beyond a deepened and more universal insight into the laws of mechanics, It stimulates thoughts in a broad sense that are directed towards universality. And then, of course, there is the ethical angle. What do you use the acquired knowledge for? As with the example of the pendulum, application of it, for example, in a useful instrument such as the so-called seismograph that serves to warn people when earthquakes occur. To summarize, one could say that the spiritual scientist, through his way of thinking as well as his concrete experiments, stimulates all other truth seekers in the world to do so from the same mentality and thereby sets in motion a dynamic that helps promote harmony in the world. It will be clear by now that in general there is a big difference in intention between modern materialistic science and spiritual science. With modern science, ethics often seems to come down to it can be done, so it is allowed. With spiritual science, one might say it is just the other way around. It is allowed when it makes sense, so it can be done. Let us briefly summarize what has been discussed. Unity, interconnectedness, and universal brotherhood are facts in nature. We can base science on these facts, and then it plays its proper role in the trio religion, philosophy, science, and is ethically, morally guided by religion and philosophy. A scientist who still only assumes lifeless and detached matter can of course also work from selfless ideas. But the logic of universal brotherhood does not follow from the materialistic theories. That scientist cannot substantiate his idealism. Modern science still tends to focus exclusively on the material realm and often does not deal consciously enough with its moral ethical motives. Spiritual or occult science, through right orientations, can penetrate deeper into truth by the right ethical moral orientation based on the idea of universal brotherhood, and thereby contributes to the evolution of all living beings and especially to ethical moral elevation of humanity. To seek the real causes of the phenomena in the world of metaphysics by assuming the idea of the living cosmos. If we really dare to take the step towards a spiritual science, science will be able to make great strides forward and fully assume its social role and responsibility. This was the lecture. We are now going to pause for 3 minutes. You can pose your questions via the chat or via email, and you can also send your request if you want to also join the study. You can do that still at the moment by sending an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org. And we see you after the break then. Erwin.
Yes.
Any questions?
Yes, there is one question. And the question is, how can something be manifested and formless at the same time? You mentioned that in one of your slides.
Yeah. Well, I think that these terms, manifestations that have form and manifestations that are formless, are concepts that are being used for us humans because these are the world of the manifested worlds that have form are manifestations that we are in one way or another able to perceive as having form, but the worlds that are formless are for us formless worlds. So they are for us, we cannot perceive that they have form. from our point of view. But for other beings that are further developed, they probably have formed, but for us, they are formed. So it is a matter of from which position you look at it, so to speak.
So it's more or less relative.
Yeah.
And then could you say like the idea of the architect of a house before it is put on paper?
Yeah.
It could be an example of something
Yeah.
that is manifested in somehow,
Yeah.
but not already for us, not yet in a form.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
That's a very good example. Actually, at our different phases of becoming from abstractions, abstract concepts, in various steps becoming more detailed and concrete until it is realized. And in the schedule, the scheme that I gave, where I make the comparison or the analogy with the description of the 4 lowers of the 7 worlds of the planet. So the top one being called the archetypical world, then the intellectual world or creative world, and then the astral world and the physical world. These are examples also expressed in words of going from a very abstract concept, like archetypical concept, a thought, to the very concrete, detailed working out of these concepts into, in the end, the material world.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Those were the questions.
Those were the questions. Thank you. As always, we will close our study with the Gayatri of the Rig Veda, which runs as follows. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.